So flexible metacardia level 1, this is all on aerobic training. So comprehensive evidence-based framework integrating physiologic, metabolic, and performance-based adaptations for improving cardiovascular fitness, VO2 max, and by consequence, endurance. So these are the principles, what I call the grand unified model of VO2 max and aerobic training principles. As you guys all know, I'm huge on what are just the overarching kind of 30,000 foot view of the principles. Because there's no way you're going to be able to get enough protocols and even enough context for every possible scenario you're going to run into. So we've got people in here who are working with high-level elite athletes to general population who've just done no cardiovascular training. And the cool part is, like, the principles will apply across that entire spectrum. So how you train someone who has a very low VO2 max to how you train someone who's an elite level cyclist, those principles actually don't change. So that's the other reason I like making sure people understand the principles. A little bit of review, some of what we covered last time. So last time we covered what I think is probably the two biggest principles. So number one is cardiac output. So cardiac output is just simply what's many times referred to as Q, or sometimes you'll see it as just CO. Like all the formal stuff is Q, but whatever. So it's just simply the amount of blood that's pumped out per minute determined by heart rate times stroke volume. So cardiac output is literally how much is coming out of the heart, your cardiac system, which is Q here, and it's just simply determined by stroke volume times heart rate. Everybody's familiar with heart rate, right? Just how fast is your heart beating. And stroke volume is how much blood per beat is actually coming out of the heart. So if we can increase stroke volume at the same heart rate, we've automatically increased cardiac output. If we increase heart rate at the same stroke volume, we've already increased cardiac output. So most people, when they do exercise, are familiar that your heart rate is going to go up. That's because your muscles need more blood, therefore oxygen, so does your brain, so does your organs. And we need to increase cardiac output when we do that. Now, there isn't a massive change to stroke volume during exercise per se. We can probably have that debate later. But what's more important is that stroke volume over time with chronic exercise can change. And that's why in the morning, if you're measuring your resting heart rate and you're tracking it over time, you start doing more cardiovascular work, you'll see that it hopefully is trending down. Why it's trending down is at rest, you still need the same cardiac output. That really hasn't changed a whole lot, but your stroke volume chronically is going up. So you're able to get a little bit more blood out of the heart with each beat. Therefore, your heart rate will go down. So one of the markers you can look for in cardiovascular adaptations is just simply is resting heart rate over time going down. Now, again, you'll have fluctuations in heart rate, and if you're more stressed or you don't get sleep, it'll go up. But over time, if we trend this long enough, we should see that it's slightly trending in the downward direction. That would be a good marker to look at. Go to the next slide here. So training adaptations, as we just talked about here, increased stroke volume, enhanced chamber filling, and contractility. So a cool kind of freebie is if you can force more blood into the chamber of your cardiac system, you get more what's called stretch, something called the Frank Starling principle. And more stretch puts these little actin and myosin, these are the little contractile filaments of fiber, even though the cardiac ones are a little bit different, but they're still very similar to muscle, right? Cardiac tissue is a muscle. It lines them up a little bit better so that you have a better contraction. And in essence, that's sort of a passive function, and it's like a free performance increase. So if you get more blood into the chamber, it'll stretch a little bit, and it puts the actin and myosin, these physical cross bridges, in a better position, and you get better contractility. You get a better squeeze of getting all that blood out of the heart. The decrease in resting heart rate is due to improved overall just cardiac efficiency. Most of that is a pickup in stroke volume. Higher maximal cardiac output, allowing more oxygenated blood to reach the muscles. It's debatable how much max heart rate will change over time. We do know that max heart rate does tend to decrease with age. How much and to what extent is, again, up for debate on that. I think training can probably mitigate a fair amount of that. But pretty much everyone will have their max heart rate, and it doesn't change a whole lot. The reason you'll see big changes in people who are new to exercise, I think, is they just get used to putting out a little bit more effort. So if you can get a really true max in a test from someone at first, it probably doesn't change a whole lot. I think their ability to work a little harder, their effort probably does change, which then allows them a little higher max heart rate. But max heart rate is a little bit kind of a fixed variable. So again, when we see those improvements in stroke volume, when you get up to exercising at very high heart rates, you're actually able to get more cardiac output at that point, therefore better aerobic performance. This involves improved blood flow distribution and then also reducing oxygen supply bottlenecks because blood flow and oxygen go hand in hand. And we've got principle number 1 is cardiac output. So what do you do about training methods? Again, this is a pretty high level view. The benefit of zone 2 training, although like I talked about in the last lecture, I think it's kind of a little bit overdone now. We're in the kind of, ooh, everything for zone 2 and it'll fix everything. It does have its place. It's definitely useful, but again, I don't think it's the best place for most people to start. I literally was having a conversation with a guy who works in the NFL the other day. He was asking me about aerobic training. We got talking about zone 2, and yeah, it might be good for recovery for some of the athletes, but even at a professional level, you still have to sell what you're doing to the athletes to get compliance. So trying to sell someone into 3 hours of aerobic training if they haven't done a whole lot, knowing they're probably not going to see a big uptick in their aerobic max or their VO2 max right away. In my opinion, that's a very hard sell. Could you do it in some cases? Yes, but I'm much bigger for more what we call zone 3 kind of cardiac work. We talked about the two methods last time. You can go back and watch that video. That's what I think a much better place to start. However, we do know that if you want to maximize long-term aerobic development, improvements in stroke volume are key to maximizing that. And zone 2 works really, really good for doing that. It's about 60 to 70% of your heart rate max for about 30 to 90 minutes per session, right? Most of the literature would say you have to accumulate about 2 to 3 hours of zone 2 work per week. I tend to run this in phases. So if I do a lot of zone 2 work, I do try to get people up to that range. And then we'll run that for maybe 6 to 8 weeks, depending upon where they're at, what they're doing. So again, the goal there is just to get a lot of blood flow into the ventricular, into the chambers, get some of that nice stretch, and then have that blood flow go out. Another little marker for zone 2 is the talk test. Again, same conversation I had with a guy yesterday about heart rate and all the other measures. And, I have a metabolic card, I've got a Moxie, I've got a Knox. All that stuff I think is useful, but I still go back to a zone 2 area is probably where you can do the old school talk test. So can you complete a couple sentences and still have a conversation with someone on the phone? They will be able to tell that you're exercising, but you can get out multiple sentences in a row. If you can do that, you're probably still in zone 2. Because remember, zone 2 by pure heart rate will change a little bit day to day based on overall stress. So I've used heart rate, I've used everything in the past, and I just still go back to the old school talk test. Again, some clients I've had in the past have one guy had like this whole like little sentences that he would read at the same time and monitor it that way. But most people will be pretty close there. If you can only get one sentence out, you're probably too high of an intensity. Another way that helps is some high intensity models. Classically is the Norwegian 4x4, but there's other ways of doing that, which we'll cover. Very, very high heart rate. And this will primarily enhance contractility, although we do get a lot of benefits in other areas. So at some point, if you want to increase your VO2 max, you have to get some intervals at a high VO2 max. I like them for anywhere from 2 to 8 minutes. Complete rest, and then you can complete and do them again. So you may only start out with one hard interval a week, maybe add one next week, maybe run that for a while, maybe add a third. Yeah, and there's nothing magical about like the 4x4 method. It works, but I literally was just doing an interview for a magazine the other day, and most people on the 4x4 method, if you look at their output, like their first round is pretty good. Their second round, in terms of output quality, not too bad. And then usually round 3 and 4, it goes off a cliff. It just drops off. Again, we want to make sure we're doing high quality work first and then repeat that. Lastly, we talked a little bit about altitude training. This can be useful for expanding blood volume. So you mentioned sauna can work for that, hydration methods can work, and it does improve oxygen delivery. Unfortunately, the effects are quite temporary. They don't last real long back to sea level. This is useful if you have athletes or yourself competing at altitude, but other than that, I don't use it a lot. You will notice it is in a fair amount of slides, and we do talk about it because it's really good at illustrating differences of what's going on. And this is because you see a change in partial pressure of oxygen. If people want to go really hard down the rabbit hole of oxygen and CO2 regulation, I think I have like 3 or 3.5 hours on that in the physiologic flexibility cert. So we'll just mention it here because it does help with blood volume and improve oxygen delivery, but we'll have other ways to do that. There you go. Best test to do this. If you've got fancy lab equipment, you can do an echo. Most people will not have information on that or ability to do that. Another way to get a proxy measure is heart rate recovery. We'll talk about that this week. And then we'll also talk about heart rate variability and resting heart rate. As we mentioned, resting heart rate, if this is improving, i.e. getting lower over time at rest in the morning, we know by definition your cardiac function is getting better. What I really like about that is it's a non-max test. You're not even doing anything. You're just sitting there recording your heart rate. Most watches, Aura devices, other wearables now for resting heart rate, they're pretty accurate. They're actually pretty good. Some of them at very high heart rates or peak or max heart rate will still miss, but resting heart rate and average heart rates are actually pretty decent right now. So you can pull it off of that device. Review item number 2, the Fick equation, or what's called the Fick principle. This is literally our equation for VO2, volume of oxygen we can run through the system. So we've got our cardiac output, which we just talked about, and it's time our AV difference. So we have cardiac output, literally how much is going through, heart rate times stroke volume. AV difference is just simply the difference in oxygen content between arterial and venous blood. Arterial is going to be the oxygen-rich blood. We're going to pull oxygen out of it, and it's going to return back to the heart as venous return, which has less oxygen. So all those adaptations we talked about increasing cardiac output, those have a direct benefit on allowing you to get to a higher VO2 max. The other way you can increase that at the high level is extract more oxygen out of the blood. So if you have a greater AV difference, you can either shove more oxygen into the arterial system, or you can extract more from the venous side. That will also increase your overall VO2 max. And we'll have more on that this week. So training adaptations enhance oxygen extraction at a tissue level. So you're able to pull out more oxygen, making the muscles more efficient. This is also related to improved mitochondrial density and function. Mitochondria, little guys that are making ATP energy, allowing for greater energy production, and obviously more and better aerobic metabolism. So better AV difference is muscles are extracting more oxygen from the blood, and this might be from increased capillarization. We just have much better micro blood flow to all the fibers, and improved oxygen diffusion to the muscle fibers. So if we can diffuse oxygen into the fiber better, obviously that's going to help with oxygenation. What methods to do this? We talked about our VO2 max intervals. Again, 2 to 8 minutes at a VO2 max intensity. On the assessment test this week, we'll show you how to figure out where that is without any technology. That's probably the best way. Now, there's a whole bunch of things in terms of adaptations that are going on there, but if we had to try to pin it on one thing, it's most likely maximizing oxygen extraction efficiency. If you have fancy equipment, you can see this by sticking what's called a Knox device or a Near device or a Moxie on a muscle and look at something called SMO2. And what you'll see in that local muscle is how far can that athlete just deplete the oxygen out of that muscle. And what I find in testing is people with a lower aerobic development or VO2 max usually can't deplete this quite as much. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of exceptions that with higher level athletes where their rate limiter may be something different. It's not uncommon that I'll see someone who is not at a higher trained, they may only be able to get down to maybe 30 or 20%, where high level athletes, sometimes you can get down into the tens or, somewhere in there. So you can just extract more oxygen directly out of the muscle. Because that increases our AV difference, that'll push up our VO2 max. So intervals are a great way to get good at doing that. Zone 2 can help by increasing mitochondrial efficiency and capillary density, so we're able to create more oxygen. Again, back to building a strong base. There's some evidence that training with high reps may enhance the capillary network. Not a ton of data here. There's not a ton of data to determine what is the best method to do that. There's some data on blood flow restriction may be useful here. If I were to bias anything, I would probably bias that direction, but we don't have a ton of data. So I would say, yes, this is a true principle. It may help, but exactly what we do that, how in an applied sense is kind of still up in the air. Yeah, and if you have fancy equipment, you can test all this stuff. You can use a metabolic cart to see what all air is going in, air is going out, O2, CO2. You can look at, like we mentioned, SMO2 by sticking this little NIRS device on the muscle. What we're going to use is something called a proxy test, where if you don't have any of that equipment that's in the thousands of dollars, you can still get a pretty darn good accurate of what their VO2 max is. And you might be able to get around and look at other limiters during that also. So in a future presentation, I've got one on what are some of the limiters of VO2 max and how can we try to test that without super fancy equipment. So we've got two more principles this week. This one is number 3, is sort of a sub-principle of the other ones, but it's oxygen delivery. So this is based on blood transport and hemoglobin optimization. So our equation here, DO2 is equal to Q times CaO2. So DO2 is simply oxygen delivery. There's a total amount of oxygen that can be delivered to the tissue per minute. Q is our cardiac output again, which we went over, right? So heart rate times stroke volume. And here, CaO2 is arterial oxygen content. So the amount of oxygen carried in the blood, which is influenced by hemoglobin concentration and oxygen saturation. So if we want better oxygen delivery, we can increase our cardiac output, right? So cardiac output is increasing heart rate, also increasing stroke volume. Or we can also increase the amount of oxygen carried in the blood. So can we jam more oxygen in there somehow? And this is primarily influenced by hemoglobin concentration, which is mostly made up of red blood cell mass, red blood cells, and oxygen saturation. How much oxygen can we kind of stick on these guys to load them up as they go by? Come on, a little slide. There we go. So blood transport and hemoglobin optimization. The cool part is training does this automatically. So some of the adaptations we see from training are increased blood volume. As we mentioned, sauna will do this. So you start doing sauna for about 1 to 2 weeks, you see an increase in blood volume, and that will definitely increase your aerobic performance. Improved oxygen transport, just getting oxygen to go where it needs to go in the body. Enhanced hemoglobin concentration. This allows more oxygen to be carried per unit of blood. So we may have the same blood volume, but if we can stick more of these carriers of it, hemoglobin and especially red blood cells, they can get more oxygen per unit of blood to be carried around. Now, there is a downside to this, right? If you looked at cyclists who were using a drug called EPO or erythropoietin, this would directly increase red blood cell mass. This would increase their performance. But the hard part was, at some point, if you have too much red blood cell mass, the volume and viscosity of your blood can become like yogurt. And then you run a huge risk of having all sorts of really nasty stuff happen. So there's all sorts of crazy stories of back in the day cyclists using EPO that would get up at like 3 a.m. in the morning and all of a sudden go for a ride. Because the biggest risk, if this hematocrit gets too high, the viscosity of the blood gets real high. And when it's not moving around, it can start to clot and get stagnant. And when that happens, your risk of having something really bad happen, like throwing a clot somewhere else, goes up. Usually this doesn't happen during exercise because you've got increased blood volume and you're already moving the blood around at a high speed. But cyclists would wake up and feel like their blood was becoming too stagnant and would all of a sudden start riding around at like 3 in the morning. So now the good part is, without the use of drugs, like, is it possible to get your viscosity that high? Probably not. There are some people who have some genetic issues. Also, if you are males using testosterone or TRT, that definitely can push up red blood cell mass. So make sure to get your blood work done and make sure to check on that. Some people are just more sensitive to it than others. So make sure you get your blood work done on that. So better oxygen binding and releasing kinetics. This allows oxygen to be delivered more efficiently to tissues, improve blood flow distribution, and adequate supply to the active muscles. So we want to get oxygen-rich blood to the active muscles so they can do more performance and do more work. So what are some of the best methods in order to train this? Again, we've got altitude here. Again, I don't expect people to do a lot of altitude training, but from an illustration of principles, it works really well. The premise they have here is live high, train low. So if you followed any of the altitude literature for a while, it's kind of gone back and forth on these. They used to say back in the day, oh, you want to train at altitude to get the positive effects of higher EPO and other things. Now they're saying probably not. You would want to live high or sleep high and train low. The reason for this is when you're training low, the partial pressure of oxygen is much higher. So you can literally drive more oxygen into the tissue and you see a higher level of performance. To get the adaptations for living in more of a hypoxic or a low oxygen environment, then you would live high. There are some people where you can get like O2 tents and all this stuff to sleep in. Again, the adaptations here are real, but they're relatively short-lived, and you probably need many, many hours to see an increase in it. It does stimulate erythropoiesis, EPO. I'll probably create a sub-module that we go over some of the stuff of like why that's important and other things you can do. The reason I also mention it is I have a feeling that this is probably going to be the next big trend. Like you'll see places where they're trying to do more hypoxic training. And again, there's a time and a place for it, but the thing you have to watch is if we just have you train in a low oxygen environment, your performance is going down. So this stimulation, the thing we're using to stimulate your body for change, you're actually getting less of. So that's a big downside to that. You want to check your iron and B12. Iron, you also want to look at things like ferritin, total iron, iron binding capacity. We'll have a separate little thing where we go over some specific blood work to look at. But that supports hemoglobin production. Looking at blood work analysis can be super useful there. Also, I got this from my buddy Dan Garner and Dr. Tommy Wood and Ben House. Simple stuff you can get with something called the CBC plus diff. So CBC plus differential. In the US, I think you could probably get it for under $30 or something now. But part of on some of these tests in a CMP, there's these little markers that look at how are your red blood cells formed. If your red blood cells are formed in a correct way and are good, oxygen delivery is going to be better. If you've got a bunch of really fugly looking red blood cells and they're kind of misshaped and they're the wrong size, at some level, that's going to impair your performance. So a very simple blood test for around $30. You can get an idea what's going on with that. Again, we'll have more info on that coming up. Again, what do we see here? Sprint intervals, forcing the body to improve oxygen transport and extraction again. So this is what's going to be most useful doing those high VO2 max intervals. So best testing, again, if you can do a VO2 max with blood lactate measurements, great. That's useful, but we'll show you some surrogate tests that also you can do. Complete blood count, CBC with ferritin, check hemoglobin, iron stores, etc. That's always good to know. In general, guys tend to run a little bit too high on iron and ferritin. Women tend to run too low. So on pretty much anyone, if I'm gonna look at basic blood work, either female or male, I'm gonna definitely do an iron panel, usually for opposite reasons. You can play around with the pulse ox. So SpO2, this can identify oxygen saturation levels. So the old school, stick the little guy on your finger here. It uses NIRS technology. And this is looking at the arterial or the atrial side. If you play around with this, what you'll find is in most people, you got to do some pretty heinous stuff to get arterial levels to drop. So even if you're playing with it, just because your arterial levels go down doesn't mean you're not getting benefit from exercise. But if you want to go really far down that rabbit hole and look at maybe depletion and repletion on the arterial side, you can get one of these guys for like $20 or something like that. You do have to be a little careful when you're doing some exercise with it. You know, trying to row with this thing on your hand doesn't work, but doing a bike or something like that works pretty good. So I'd encourage people to play with that. The downside is it's only looking at the arterial side, and the arterial side is pretty well protected most of the time. Like you got to do some crazy stuff to see drops in on the arterial side. All right. So number 4 is heart rate regulation and autonomic regulation. So this will be the last principle we cover today. So faster heart rate recovery, HRR, this is a drop in heart rate post-exercise. And this generally has to be close to max exercise, at least for the numbers we're giving you here. This does correlate with a better VO2 max and cardiac efficiency. So if you have someone do a max test, I'm a huge fan of having do a 2-minute heart rate recovery test. If it's a true max test, they're not going to feel like doing crap like for a couple minutes at least after the test anyway. So we might as well grab some cool heart rate data. We're going to have heart rate data from the exercise. We want to try to find what their max heart rate is. We'll have a little thing later about 220 minus your age is, in my opinion, basically worthless. Like if I could go back and change any one concept for cardiovascular training, I would throw that one out the window because it just causes more confusion. It's not that accurate on an individual basis. Yes, it will get you semi-close on a population status, but nobody cares about that. They want to know, like, what is my max? So I like doing a max test and measure their actual max heart rate. And then until proven otherwise, that is their max. So if Karen comes in to do exercise and we have her do a max test and she hits 162 beats per minute, even if she just barely touches that, cool. I'm going to record her max heart rate as 162. Now, as she gets better and is able to maybe push a little bit harder, maybe on her next exercise test, she gets 165. Great. 165 is her new number. If she gets 161, nope, I'm still using 165 for quite a while, unless it's been like 10 years later or something like that. So I always like using an actual true max heart rate of whatever they hit. And if they do better on it, that's going to be their new max heart rate at this point. So assuming they get to a max or close to a max for this test, we're going to look at how fast does your heart rate get back down to baseline. My very rough back of the envelope guide is if you can get greater than 50 beats per minute over 2 minutes, that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy. Like, I think are you like elite world-class level? No, but I think that's pretty darn good. I like what I call the 50-50 rule. If you can hit 50 beats per minute on a 2-minute test for heart rate recovery and your VO2 max is 50 milliliters per kg or greater, you're doing pretty darn good, right? Again, is this elite level status? No, but for vast majority of people, and especially a vast majority of lifters, that's probably going to be more than adequate for them. Again, some people may not even need to reach quite those numbers depending upon what they're doing. There is a 1-minute test we'll talk about later. I like the 2 minute test a little bit better because I think it just gives you a little bit more data. Most watches will default to the 2 minute test. So I have a Garmin Phoenix. I feel like I should do an ad for them. At the end of it, there's a little area where you can hit a button and ask it to do a heart rate recovery, and it'll automatically do it for you. So in the Garmin one, at least on the Phoenix, it's a 2 minute test. The cool part about it is that it'll automatically grab that max heart rate. And so like if I'm doing the rower, I do like I did had to do this the other day to see where my 2K was. I did like an RPE of a 9. And at the end of the test, it's going to take you a few seconds to gather your thoughts and figure out like what universe you're in again. And so I already hit stop on my watch, but it'll record that and then I can air down a few menus and like 20 seconds later, I can start the 2 minute test, but it was already started from my max right away. So if you don't have someone else doing it or you're not recording your entire heart rate the whole time, little features like that are just kind of handy. But if you don't have that, just have something that's going to record your heart rate the entire time. Wait 2 minutes later, and you can just calculate it. You're literally just looking for max to 2 minutes later. This is a good marker for what's called parasympathetic reactivation. So bigger aerobic engine, the better your parasympathetic nervous system is, the faster it allows you to get back to baseline. One of the concepts I like is what I call human dynamic range. Like in heart rate, what's the lowest heart rate you can go? What's the max heart rate you can go to? And within that, if you go to a max, how fast can you get back to baseline again? So heart rate recovery is literally measuring how fast you can get back to baseline again. So training adaptations here, heart rate variability, we'll talk a little bit about that coming up, is a good marker for vagal tone. So vagal tone adaptations improve cardiac efficiency. So as you start training your aerobic system more, you increase what's called vagal tone or parasympathetic adaptations, and your heart rate variability will reflect this, and you'll see a better heart rate variability. Which brings us to, okay, what is heart rate variability? Heart rate variability is a good marker of your autonomic nervous system. So on one hand, we've got the stress side is, I don't know if maybe I'm old, anyone remember like Bill the Cat? So we have our sympathetic side, and then we've got our sleeping polar bear, which is how I like all my polar bears. I don't want them chasing me around. Parasympathetic. So parasympathetic, vagal, decrease in heart rate, like stepping on the brake of your car. Sympathetic, increasing heart rate is more of the stress side. So the autonomic nervous system is controlling how much you're parasympathetic and how much you are sympathetic. That is literally what HRV is doing. This is from the HRV education course. Variability analysis is science of measuring the degree and character of pattern and variations of a time series of a biologic parameter in order to evaluate the state of the underlying complex nervous system or complex system responsible for the biologic signal. And don't worry, the whole course isn't like this. It's like literally like the most technical slide in the whole course. But what it's saying is, if we do variability analysis, we're looking at variability in something, it can give us a good idea of what's going on in this really, really complex system. And it turns out doing a variability analysis, aka heart rate variability, will literally tell us the status of our autonomic nervous system, which is pretty cool. How far are you sympathetic? How far are you parasympathetic? And this is all integrated into the brief model here. So here's our heart rate. We obviously want to keep cardiac output, blood pressure. This is subregulated by the ROS system, renin, aldosterone, angiotensin system, influenced by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic side of the nervous system. So all these correlate to make sure that, again, you get decent blood flow primarily to your brain and to your cardiac tissue. HRV has been around for a long time. This is from Billman, 2011. If you want the history of HRV, you can pull that. It's, open access. The key part here is that we've known about HRV for a long time. Like they first identified beat-to-beat pulse variability in like 1733. We've had ways of measuring HRV since the 60s. HRV time domain analysis was done there originally by the Russian cosmonauts. So it's been around for a long time, but involves a lot of math and gets pretty messy right away. So it takes a while to be used. For HRV, all we're simply doing is looking at how variable is it from one heartbeat to the next. which is monitored by our QRS or our R wave here. We're just literally measuring in milliseconds how variable that is. And these are fine scale variability changes. If we can do that, we can get a heart rate variability. The more fine scale variability, the more you are on the parasympathetic side. As you start losing fine scale variability, you are on more the sympathetic side. When you do this, though, you have to be careful of noise, make sure you're getting true complexes, and there's all sorts of different ways of doing this. So I've often joked that whenever we try to apply math to physiology, it's complicated because physiology is literally every bad engineering word known to man. It's nonlinear, it's complex, it's anisotropic, it's chaotic. So sometimes we do need a little bit more complex math in order to figure that out. So my master's was actually in mechanical engineering, so I got to do all that fun stuff. So what do we do with this? So let's say we want to get better autonomic regulation. Cool. So we're going to do some zone 2 training. That can definitely help with that. That can enhance parasympathetic tone. Just more movement in general can enhance parasympathetic tone. Pretty much anything that improves VO2 max, as long as you don't overdo it, will actually increase parasympathetic tone. Now, is it true that you could just beat the crap out of yourself with VO2 max intervals and see a drop in parasympathetic tone? Yes. That's more due to the acute stress response. You can do what's called heart rate recovery focused intervals, aligned for better cardiac control and adaptation. So when we do the VO2 max intervals, you will probably get to a high heart rate, and then I actually like for that heart rate to come down by quite a bit. In most people, I want to see it probably under 100, and then they would do their next interval again. So we're literally skyrocketing heart rate, we're holding it there for a period of time, we're allowing it to recover, and then we're hitting it again. So we're actually training that heart rate recovery. 1 minute test, usually most of the literature would say a drop of 20 or more during 1 minute is pretty good. A drop of 50 over 2 minutes, it's kind of my preference. The cool part is if you do the 2-minute test, you will automatically, because you're keeping track of time, you'll have the 1-minute test also. So another reason I like doing that. We can monitor heart rate variability. So higher HRV correlates with improved cardiovascular health and reduction in risk of disease also.